I figured the first thing would be to give you a frame of reference for the talk. So in Mage's Tale, you are an apprentice wizard in virtual reality. You're using touch controls to wield the elemental forces of nature. You're throwing fireballs, ice javelins, shooting at lightning like Emperor Palpatine. And you're going through a narrative quest where you're crawling through dungeons.
And the only ones who can save him are myself and... Oh, the gods help me. You. Hurry, child! There's an army of enemies between us and poor Mage Algwyn. So gather your mystic ingredients and craft your spells of fire, ice, wind, and lightning, and craft them well. Trust me, you're going to need them. The sorcerer's minions are many, from disgusting little goblins to the clattering, chattering undead, to huge and hideous giants, to wicked wizards nearly as powerful as Mage Algwyn's kidnapper himself. Not to mention the fiendish traps and puzzles and secret doors he's put in our way to mangle, muddle, and confound us. Are you ready for all that, my little flea's breakfast? Are you? I certainly hope so. Otherwise, we're doomed. Well, come on then. Better get to it.
Hey, bite now. We already went over this. But today we're going to answer one core question and be super focused. And that question is, how do we determine where someone's throwing in virtual reality? When we started this game, we knew the game was going to be about motion and kinetics. We're going to be blocking. We want people throwing over here, blocking over here, summoning spells. And if we didn't get that right immediately, the entire game was going to be a flop. So it didn't make a ton of sense to go forward on building a ton of content until we really got the core loop down of throwing an object forward at a target nailed. So when we think of throwing in virtual reality, here I'm using an Oculus Rift and Oculus Touch, but it really doesn't matter what you're using. When you're thinking about throwing in virtual reality, it could be a carnival game. It could be you just tossing physics objects. You sort of imagine this like this ideal throw. It's a nice shallow arc. Someone at, around here ideally lets go of the object and goes sailing, and that was the presupposition that we had when we went into it. And hopefully, if anyone's going into any game that has touch controls of any kind, you can listen to this talk, skip a couple of needless iterations, and then get going a little bit faster. So the first thing we found is people are super lazy. And it's not their fault, but they're having fun. And doing this and being really energetic looks good in commercials. But in reality, people, when they're a mighty wizard, kind of Expelliarmus, and they just really lazily just toss fireballs out there. And the curve is actually far steeper than you would expect. And when you're trying to measure trajectory, the steepness of the curve based on someone's elbow is super, super important. I wonder if this works. And so the first thing you do, and it's pretty darn simple, is you're tracking the position of the touch controller frame after frame after frame. You're running your game at 90 frames per second, and if you don't, everyone will throw up. So when someone lets go of that touch controller button, the common standard is you hold down a button to say, I'm holding this object. As soon as you release it, you say, I'm not holding it. And it continues along the path that it was when you let it go. And so commonly, you're just tracking every single frame. What is the position in world space of my hand and the given object? And as soon as I let go, you just pull the current vector of its position and the previous vector. And you say, well, what is their difference? And you send it along that route. It seems pretty simple. That's what we thought at first. Turns out it wasn't. There was two major problems. Oh, cool. The first one is everyone is really innately bad at timing. We're not like a prehistoric civilization. We don't go hunting a lot. And so people are just really uncoordinated. But we still want them to feel like a wizard. And so we just found that everyone had a tendency to just release really late. If you're throwing a fireball, we want them to release here. And more commonly, they're just releasing there. They're just kind of bad at throwing. Secondly, when people are throwing, they have a tendency, like they're shooting hoops or something, to flick their wrist. And that can change the angle at which someone's throwing by up to 90 degrees. When you add these things together, you find out that everyone just sucks at throwing. And we'll get first-time users in. And this is something that reveals itself with first-time user playing and not developer play. The developers were great at, they programmed it, so they were great at accounting for the algorithms that they built. But we would get a first-time user in there, and they would see a goblin off in the distance, 20 yards, charge up their fireball, feel really good, and then just spike it directly into the ground and feel like a clod. A lot of these can be explained pretty simply. So here we see someone throwing a baseball. That's kind of like the best example that we can go off of. You're going to try and find that moment of release on this baseball, and you won't be able to find it. And this was kind of a big epiphany for us, is that when throwing an object, humans don't have a moment of release. Release is a period of time. To play this again, I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So when someone's throwing an object, there's a moment right around here where the thumb disconnects from the ball, but the top two fingers are still guiding and pushing that object. The ball itself has inertia, unlike your touch controllers, which are kind of built to be weightless. And so it has a tendency to want to continue along its trajectory. And you have to account for all this because people are throwing based off the intuition they built from living in the world with physics. And then they're going to step into your game, and your job as a VR developer is to match their natural intuition so that the things they think can happen will happen, so they keep exploring your game. So the way you can account for this sort of failure in logic is to turn the release from a moment into a period of time. If your game's running at 90 frames per second, there's some math down there, it doesn't really matter. I just like calculators. You can track the controller's position for the past 30 or 15 frames to get a period of time. And as soon as they hit that moment of release, whatever button threshold you set, it could be 20, 80%, I would caution you against ever putting any button threshold at 0 or 100 because some people never fully depress buttons and some people never fully let them go. The moment they have that point of release, you average, do a weighted average across the past 15, 30, however many frames you found useful. And with a weighted average, weighting the, well, first off, does everyone know what a weighted average is? Okay, cool. You weight the moment of release most highly. That's the moment of intent that a player says, yes, I want to let this go. You weight that highly, and it tapers off. But what that does is it pitches your shot up and accounts for the fact that they said, I want to release. They made that decision to release here, and then they're following through and then continuing that decision all throughout that path. So great, now people aren't just spiking things into the ground. We fixed this big problem. But you still suck at throwing. And now the problem is you actually suck at throwing. And which is a problem because in VR we want to make you feel like a badass. And so our question changes. It's not how do we detect what you're throwing. It's not mechanically how we do the math. It's that how do we make the player feel like a badass? And so the answer we arrived at was pre-auto aim. So everyone knows auto aim. My bullet's going to curve to hit the nearest actor that I'm detecting within a radius, and that's easy. But you also fall into the trap of the game, me feeling bad and the game feeling easy. When you rely too heavily on sort of real-time shots curving through the air, you don't make the player feel powerful. You make them feel like they're playing an easy game. And so we use both kinds of auto aim. But what I'm going to talk about here is pre-auto aim. And what I mean by that is at that point of release, we're going to adjust the trajectory at which the fireball is going to leave the hand so the player thinks that they're way better at throwing than they actually are. My favorite example is if I gave a baseball to you, sir, in the back and asked you to peg me square in the chest, I'd give you $5 if you can do it in 5 tries. Like, we're standing 20, 30 yards apart, and I'm actually, relatively narrow, and a couple of degrees will completely throw it off. So unless you're an athlete, you're terrible at being a wizard, which completely defeats the point of the game that we're trying to make. So a really simple thing you can do is you can care about where someone is looking. Most people, most of the time, are looking directly at the target that they want to peg. And that's really, really handy. And so you can take the vector coming out, like basically the look vector of the Oculus, and you can factor that in, and you can weight that into the average that we gathered earlier from the throw vector. Because 9 times out of 10, if I want to throw at you, I'm looking directly at you. And so by including that vector, all of my shots will train towards what I'm looking at. And what we found is people never, thankfully, never throw looking out of the sides of their eyes. It's just never something we ran into in user testing. So this was really successful, except in a couple of cases. The whole point of pre-auto aim is to not give away the game. If people know that we're cheating for them, they don't feel like a badass. They don't want to come back and brag and show off to their friends and then put other people in the game. And so we ran into situations where someone would be going through the dungeon and they would have a spell and they'd want to jauntily toss it off to the side. Or they might want to, they have a bouncing fireball that shoots confetti and you know, because there's crafting in our game. And they'd want to like spike it off the ground in some really fanciful way to make it rebound around the room. And when you just took the look vector, we gave away the game. I would throw it downwards and it would kind of go at like a 45-degree angle. I would throw it behind me and it would sort of shoot up. And it really threw a lot of things off. But this was pretty easily overcomeable. And there's a super handy little math operation that helps us. This is actually wrong. I'll tell you in a second. But if you take the normalized direction of the throw vector and the normalized look vector, and you do a dot product, you'll get a value between -1 and 1. -1 being, so how it works is I have, if I'm throwing my fireball and I do a dot product between both of their vectors, I'll get a value between -1 and 1. 1 means that the direction I'm throwing and the direction I'm looking are perfectly in line with one another. I am throwing right down the barrel. If I throw something directly up, then I'll get a value of 0, and if I'm throwing something completely backwards, I'll get a value of -1. And so we can use this in some really, really useful ways. And there's also some really cool math tricks you can do with dot products, because dot products are naturally exponential. And so there's this really weird, it's not totally intuitive, but if me throwing directly forward with my I vector produces a dot product value of 1, and me throwing directly up produces dot product value of 0, me throwing at a 45-degree angle for my look vector, you would think would produce a 0.5. But it doesn't, it's a 0.707. And so dot products are naturally exponential, which is super useful when you use that dot product to weight the look vector into your throwing trajectory. So what we ultimately arrived at was a system that looks like this. You can imagine coming out of the player's face a series of cones. And those cones represent the outer bounds and the inner bounds of the player's look vector. When the player would throw a fireball, we would ask a couple of questions. Is the fireball outside the outer bounds? We set it pretty generally at about 45 degrees. If I'm throwing jauntily off to the left or I'm spiking it directly into the ground, ignore the look vector altogether. The player's clearly not intending to throw in that direction. That's what all of this is about, is establishing player intent. And if the player is throwing within an inner bounds, you know, we set about 15, 10, you know, you're going to tune it, 15 or 10 degrees, then we can say with certainty the player is attempting to throw at what they're looking at. And people are far more accurate with their head and their eyes than they are with their hands. And so we can say if they're throwing like directly forward, we can weight the look vector very highly and help them be slightly more accurate and not be off by a couple of different degrees and feel like an idiot in their dungeon. So this was super useful to us. All of a sudden, we went from people sort of like stumbling around the dungeon, seeing a goblin 20 yards away, throwing like 10, 15, 20 fireballs, missing. We know we're calculating everything properly, but that doesn't help the player one bit. 2, the player seeing a goblin, nailing him with a fireball, feeling like a badass, and then moving on. And then all of a sudden, the pacing of our game really increased. But there was one more problem. Ergonomics. So anyone who's using look vector for anything, I don't care how you're doing it. It could be look at triggers inside your game because you want the happy cloud to smile at you, when you look at it, or it could be because that's how interaction prompts appear. One really obnoxious thing came up is that people don't look directly forward. And that was a huge hassle for us. There's a couple of explanations. One is with any kind of VR headset, there is a focal point within the lens that you have to account for, and that's kind of person to person. At what point do you wear the headset up and down where everything comes into focus? And that's not necessarily the same for everyone. There's also this really obnoxious, maybe you could gauge how pompous someone is, but some people, they just kind of look down at you, and that's their natural head resting position. And then some people are a little bit more shy or aggressive, and they tend to look at the top. And so how their head naturally rests when they're looking directly forward also changes things. And so now we have this really useful look vector, but we can't trust it fully. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is that we, within the inner bounds that we've defined, if the player's throwing within those inner bounds, you shouldn't weight the look vector at 100%. That's just a good way for the player to throw where they're looking, but not where they're intending, and now we haven't measured player intent. And so we're looking at like weighting the look vector at like 50, 60, 70%. And over time, the players, like with any game, they'll start to understand that I tend to throw low because of how I'm wearing my headset, little do they know, and they'll start to release sooner, or vice versa. And so the players will compensate after 10, 15 minutes of the core play loop, as long as you're not taking the look vector too seriously. But another thing we did was we added a reticule. And so, this kind of goes back to more classic game mechanics, where we were constantly scanning within this cone actors in the game space that were likely targets for the player to want to throw at. It could be a barrel, a potion, an enemy. It could be debris on the ground. It could be anything. And we're constantly scanning for targets within their direct look vector. And then when we do that, we can say, oh, he's most closely looking at that goblin right there. I'm pretty sure he wants to throw at the goblin even though he's looking slightly below him. Let's replace your look vector with a trajectory that matches the vector between myself and that goblin. And we can replace that look vector, and then all of a sudden now we're measuring player intent much more closely. And there's a really cool thing that you shouldn't get super hung up on. If someone intends to hit a goblin and they hit a barrel, they still feel pretty good about hitting something. And they count it as kind of like, yeah, I totally meant to do that, like even internally. And so you still get a little joy out of hitting the wrong thing as long as you hit something. And so just doing any kind of auto detection there is a huge step up. And then the second element is exposing the mechanics. If you're caring about look vector, it's useful to ever so subtly tip your hat to the player and just let them know that where you look matters. You don't have to tell them it's a game mechanic, but just tell them that it matters. And so what we did is initially we put a reticle directly on the screen. We would depth sort it so you wouldn't get double vision and get a headache. And then when you look directly at a target, we would encircle it in arcane sigils and sorcery, and it made you feel really cool. We didn't necessarily say it was a lock-on mechanic, but it caused people to correlate them looking at targets with them hitting targets, and it would just adjust their behavior automatically. You would then also reinforce those with obviously the visuals of the sigil, haptics, and audio. Everything has to be reinforced with haptics. Haptics refers to, on any touch controller, haptics refers to the little rumble that you get in your hand. It refers to any kind of like tactile sensation that the game is putting into you. And so like when you go to, hey, that's sort of how we throw fireballs. There's a couple of cool other lessons that we can get into, and one of them happens to be about haptics. For anyone developing virtual reality, especially with touch controllers, the haptics are absolutely crucial. For presence purposes, it's not particularly advantageous to fill your game with user interface, be it floating in front of you like like holograms or whatever, because it makes it feel very gamey, and then it sort of destroys that presence. And so anything you can put directly on the body and anything you can deliver to the player diegetically, like if you take damage, having your controllers rumble, or like letting your controllers rumble when there's like a valid pickup object nearby, that does you a lot of good. But there's also this really obnoxious lesson that we learned that players will ignore haptics. And so you both can't ignore them, but you also can't rely on them. When a player in Mage's Tale being an RPG, when a player in Mage's Tale is ready to level up and ascend to the next level of power, we shake the controller violently to let them know that they can touch a little element on their hand and level up. And I've seen players walk around for 10, 15 minutes with their controller just going absolutely bananas. And they just assume the game's broken or something, and they don't attach meaning to it. So there's a lot of like reinforcement loops you have to do to say like, hey, when your controller does this, this is what it means. Because if you ignore that, they have a tendency to ignore haptic feedback. I genuinely don't know why, and I'd listen to a talk on it. Secondly, when we're talking about throwing, bouncing is really, really, really gratifying, particularly when you start including auto-aim mechanics into your game. If I can ever rebound anything off of anything and then hit anything, I feel like a total badass. And so every time you rebound, you can run little fun auto-aim mechanics to make sure that, like, as you're rebounding objects, they're adjusting the trajectory ever so slightly to make them more likely to hit things, and that's a really good way to make the player feel like Neo or something. And lastly, this is just another random lesson that we learned. Has anyone ever heard of Jane McGonigal, the famous game designer? So Jane McGonigal coined a term called power poses, and these are poses that you can take and they make you feel very powerful, like, you know, puff your chest out. You can, you know, things that make you feel like victory and endorphins rush. And as you're developing in virtual reality, it counts for throwing, it counts for blocking, it counts for leveling up. Anytime you can force the player with your touch controllers to take these Jane McGonigal power poses, you're making them feel more like a badass, and they can't even tell why. When the player wants to teleport back to their mage's laboratory, we make them take the victory pose. And everyone really just sort of universally enjoys striking these powerful poses. We'll purposefully place enemies at your flanks, and there's a mechanic with shields that force you to take open postures because I need to defend from both sides. And anytime you open the player's posture up, they just feel more powerful. They feel more like a badass.
So how long did it take you during development to do all that?
So I would say our iteration time was slower because almost all of these revelations came with new user experience testing. And so we would pull someone fresh off the street. We pulled like a barista from the coffee shop across the street in and had them play. We would bring college students in and have them play. We would have people from other projects play. And this whole iteration process probably took 6 months for us to get throwing feeling as good as it did, 6 or 8 months. But that's because we would do something. We would test it ourselves. We knew what we did, so subconsciously we were adhering to the rules that we had defined. Like, if you just program the algorithm, you are naturally going to behave in such a way that plays nicely with the algorithm. And so it's not until you get new users in that sort of your assumptions get totally blown away. And so, yeah, it was probably 6 or 8 months to get it completely nailed, just because we had to bring someone in for them to challenge our preconceptions.
So how did you fit that in the, you had a launch date, right? Or like, did you have like a, from the business side, given that it took 6 months, how did you fit that into like your launch date? How did you convince yourself that it's not good enough and you had to keep working on it?
Well, let's just say we were going to launch it like hell or high water. Like that was just the contract that we had, so it was going to happen. This is an Oculus Studios title, so we worked with Oculus Studios. They said, please make us a game. We said we will, and then we signed some paper. And so obviously it was going to get launched no matter what. But from a confidence standpoint, sure, there was a period of time where we were like, oh my God, like people suck at this game and they're not having fun. Like, I'm really concerned. But somewhere around the time where we started incorporating look vectors in, that we would see glimpses of success. We would see certain people by happenstance just who behaved within our boundaries, like having fun and actually nailing sort of like random objects around the world. And it was that moment where we just said, okay, we're gonna get this. And that, you know, like a couple of months in, we were like, all right, we're on the right track. There's still so much tuning we want to do. But that was kind of our aha moment where we were like, okay, I'm not worried about this anymore. We still have to spend some time on it. But up until then, yeah, it was nerve-wracking.
I was wondering if you investigated any, if you tried out any more general purpose gesture recognition first, or if you guys just went straight to your specialized solution.
So gesture in terms of like how the player activated like abilities, for instance. One thing that we found, and this is just universal across VR development, as far as I'm concerned, is that your job is not to tell the player how to engage with virtual reality. Your job is to, you could almost, like a good way to go about it would have been, hey, this is a game about being a wizard and you can cast spells, go. Even before you have any of those mechanics in, and just see what the player naturally wants to do to cast spells, and then you watch and you write it down, and then you copy that. And so really often we would see players in our game try all sorts of things. There would be an object they would try to interact with. Like we had a horn. It was just a prop we had. And players would try and blow it. And we're like, well, damn it, now we have to make the horn work. Because the moment the player takes an intuitive leap, like, oh, I can blow horns. I bet if I put it to my mouth, it'll make a noise. The moment that stops being true, the player stops exploring the world, and they start going, oh yeah, I'm in a game, and there's very specific rules. And so as you're doing development, you just have to constantly be watching what is the player's natural intuition. And so you give someone a burning ball of lava, their natural intuition is to get it out of their hands, like just go, and then there's like a thing over there, and they just do that. and then so you match that. But similarly, like we have other spellcasting mechanics, like shooting lightning. And so what we did is we said, well, people like Star Wars, and Emperor Palpatine goes like this. And so, you know, and other people seem to want to shoot lightning like this. And so that's how we defined our spellcasting mechanics, is what people wanted to do innately.
Would you be so kind to put up the first slide of who you are?
Sure thing. I have no expectation that you know who I am or remember after this. But I'm happy to.
So your company's cardinal point?
No, that's just a random shirt from, I think, a theme park. I got it at the thrift store. My company is inXile Entertainment.
Okay.
I can see where that would be confusing. So we make games. We made Wasteland 2, Wasteland 2 Director's Cut. We put out Torment Tides of Numenera. This was a really interesting experience building this game because we're a traditional computer RPG, a CRPG company. So we make like core games for PC nerds, like, and so this was our first VR title, and so there was a ton of growing pains just figuring out the base differences between developing for virtual reality, which is both a different audience and then also a totally different interface mechanism, and it has very different goals too. And so that was probably, well, that's kind of how the talk was born, is we just stumbled through a process of trying to figure out how the hell you develop for virtual reality, and we wanted to jumpstart a couple of people.
And the reason it's a casual game is because it's G?
Hmm?
Why do you consider it a casual game?
Oh, I don't.
Okay. All right.
No, it's a 12-hour-long dungeon crawling action adventure. It is very much a core game. But I think a lot of the lessons, even casual games that you find in virtual reality, games like Far Lands, for instance, that follow that same model, all these same lessons apply on how you allow players to interact with physics systems and how you recognize motion controls.
Great. All right, let's give it up for David. Great talk.
Hey, thanks so much for coming. I appreciate it.